Okay, we're going to get started this evening, and Kyle's going to be right around in this area. So if you feel like you need to get up and move forward, we are not going to be mad at you at all. We won't even say anything. So if you want to move closer so you can hear him, make sure that you get all you can out of this session. So we're so glad to have Kyle. He's coming to us from Columbia, Tennessee. He has been with Apologetics Press for 23 years now. And if you have not heard Kyle Butt speak, you are in for a treat tonight, because he does an excellent job of making sense of creation and how things came to be, and you're really going to walk away tonight with some good information. So I'm not going to take any more of his time. So thankful that you're here this evening, and I will turn it over to Mr. Kyle Butt.
In the beginning was matter, and matter begot the amoeba begot the worm begot the fish begot the amphibian begot the lizard begot the lower mammal begot the lemur begot the monkey begot the man who imagined God. This is the genealogy of man. Now, that is almost a verbatim quote from a man by the name of Charles Smith, who, when he was alive, was a very prestigious atheist. In a nutshell, he has defined for us the concept of what we would call in our culture unbelief, atheism, sometimes lumped in with agnosticism. That idea that this physical material world is all that there is, all that there was, or all that there ever will be. That there's nothing supernatural, there's no God, there's no soul, there is no spirit, there is no afterlife. This physical world is all there is. And subsequently, from this physical world, the standard model goes that 13.82 billion years ago, there was a huge explosion called the Big Bang. And immediately following that explosion, there was something called inflation that sped up every single element in the universe faster than the speed of light. And then that came to a slowdown, and stars started to coalesce out of the hydrogen, and they would then explode, and the other elements would be baked in the various different stars. And some 5 billion years ago, our solar system formed, and the Earth formed out of space dust coalescing around the sun, and that's how we got here. Ultimately, about 4.8 billion years ago, a warm chemical soup on planet Earth that was non-living was struck by something like lightning that supposedly caused those non-living chemicals to give rise to the first single-celled life. And then Charles Smith's quote. At the present, in the United States of America, they explain to us, people who look at the surveys and the stats, that unbelief is the fastest growing religion in the nation. Meaning that it's the fastest growing system of belief. Now, when you say system of belief, I understand that if you are an unbeliever, someone who doesn't believe in God, someone who says I'm an atheist, then you would not necessarily categorize your unbelief as a belief system. And I understand that. I'm just giving you the jargon of the surveys as they describe this particular belief system. 22 million people right now in the United States are either atheists, saying there is no God. That's about 3% of the adult population. Or about 4% of the adult population are agnostics. And an agnostic says, I'm about 98% sure there's not a God. I can't prove 100% that there's not. And so I'm not going to say I know there's not, but I'm about as sure that there's not a God as I'm sure that there's not a unicorn that has magical powers that can do things in my backyard. That's what they would say. About 22 million. So that's if you took the city of Birmingham, which has about 1 million people in it, and you multiplied it by 22, and every single person in those 22 cities the size of Birmingham, Alabama, was an adult and said they didn't believe in God. That's what you're looking at. Okay? Unbelief. There's another idea that's encapsulated in a similar yet diametrically opposed statement to that, and it goes something like this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God divided the light from the darkness, and the light he called day, the darkness he called night, and evening and a morning, day one. Subsequently, day two, he creates the expanse. Day three, the flowers, grass, and trees, all vegetation and plants. Day four, sun, moon, and stars. Day five, birds and fish. Day six, humans and all land-living animals. And on the seventh day, ceases his creative activity. You'll notice that there are some things that are very different from that creation story and narrative than the big explosion idea. According to creation, as you read it in Genesis chapter 1, the sun and stars were not created until day 4, while the earth was created on day 1. The earth did not coalesce out of space dust that was moving around the sun in the creation model. It was the first thing that was created. So as you look at those two ideas, in a nutshell, creation suggests to us that there is a supernatural creator intelligence outside of the universe. He is not a part of the universe. He is an entity that stands alone outside of it. Now, it doesn't mean he doesn't interact with it, but he is supernatural. Those are your basic two ideas. You've got creation, and you've got this idea of unbelief, atheistic, no God, no spirit, no anything other than physical stuff. Now, what you're told is that one of those is scientific, and one of those is faith-based. You're told that that idea of a huge explosion billions of years ago is a scientific idea because you can test it. And you're told that that idea of a belief in God is not science. And so lots of times people will not even want to have a discussion about creation and evolution or atheism and unbelief in the same realm of disciplines, in the same discussion, because they will say, well, you're dealing with two totally different things. One of these is faith-based. One of these is fact-based. And the idea of creation is not scientific. The idea of atheism and subsequently the evolutionary idea, those are scientific. That's what you've been told. That's not true, but you have been told that. Because people have changed the definition of science. Historically, science was well understood to be the search for the explanation that most adequately explains the phenomena that you are looking at. The search for the explanation that most adequately explains it. You know, it's interesting to me that there is an entire branch of physics known as Newtonian physics that is named after Sir Isaac Newton, and Sir Isaac Newton wrote more Bible commentary than he ever did write scientific papers. Now, you don't know him for his Bible commentary. You know him for his scientific discoveries, but he had absolutely no problem understanding that if there was an explanation that matched what you saw, and that explanation was a supernatural explanation, then it was completely scientific to come to that conclusion if it explained the phenomena the best. But in modern scientific circles, what has happened is the idea of creation has been defined out of the discussion. And here's what I mean by that. We are told that the idea of creation, the idea of a creator, cannot be scientific because the new definition of science is the search for naturalistic explanations that best explain a phenomena. Now, I'm going to repeat that. The search for naturalistic explanations that best explain. What happens when you define an entire category out of the discussion before you even start the discussion? Well, I'm going to show you what happens. You know that this would get you in quite a bit of trouble because here's how it would look. Suppose that you come up to a person's backyard and there's an apple that's sitting in the grass in that person's backyard, and a person comes to you and says, oh, hey, I'm glad that you're a forensic scientist. Glad you are here. I would like for you to explain something about this apple. Now, work with me. We're not all forensic scientists, and Just put yourself in the story for me. So you're going to act like you're a forensic scientist in this illustration. And he brings the apple to you and says, hey, I'd like for you to explain how this chunk got out of this apple. And you look, and sure enough, there's a large chunk that is out of the apple. And he says, I'd like for you to look at all the evidence and find the answer as long as you don't say it's a human. Okay, so he's going to define a potential answer out of the discussion before you start the discussion. Let's see how that works. So you take the apple and you look, and it looks like a bite mark of some sort. So you knock on the door of the person who owns the house, and they come to the door. And there again, work with me. This is hypothetical. But you say, hey, do you happen to have your dental records? And he says, oh, yeah, I was just at the dentist today. Here they are right here. And he pulls them out of his back pocket, hands them to you. And you take his dental records, and they match the bite pattern perfectly of this particular apple. You think, that's curious. And then you swab the apple and you send it off, and a DNA sample comes back, and you go back to the front door and you knock on it. You say, hey, I know this is kind of odd, but would you mind letting me have a DNA sample? Could you swab the inside of your cheek with this Q-tip? And he takes it, swabs it, sends it off. It's a perfect DNA match to the DNA that was found in the leftover part of the chunk of the apple. Then you dust the apple for fingerprints, and on the top of the apple there is a middle finger fingerprint. On the bottom there's a thumb. Looks like somebody was holding it just like that, maybe taking a bite out of it. And you check the fingerprints, and you knock once again on the front door, and you say, hey, would you mind letting me see your fingerprints? He happens to have them printed out for you. Knowing where you're going with this is the third time. The fingerprints match perfect. The DNA is a perfect match. The dental match is perfect. You go back to the person who commissioned you to find the answer, and you say, hey, I've got the answer. The guy who owns the house took a bite out of that apple and threw it in his backyard. That's the best explanation. He says, while that might be the best explanation for all of the evidence, I challenged you to answer the question without a human involved, so it doesn't count. What's your next best explanation? Well, now what are you going to try to do? If you are forced to say that chunk cannot be answered saying that a human did it, where do you go from there? Then you start thinking outlandishly. Okay, some kind of slug happened to crawl through the chunk in the apple that somehow left a DNA pattern that matched the guy in the house perfectly and has never been seen on a slug before, but it has to have been that way because that's the only thing that crawled through the apple. And the way the chunk got out of the apple was when it fell out of the tree. Somehow the bite mark is not really a bite mark, it's a bark pattern that when the apple fell across the bark of the tree, we've never seen it happen like that, but a huge, very strong wind knocked it into the... You see what you have to do there? You have to start reaching for things that aren't the best explanation, but they fit the definition. Okay, not human. Well, when you define out of terms a possible explanation, then you're stacking the deck, aren't you? Well, the next challenge to the idea of creation is that, okay, well, you can't do an experiment on God. And because you can't do an experiment on God, science is something where you use your five senses, things that you can touch, see, taste, hear, and smell. And because you'll never be able to touch, see, taste, hear, and smell God on this side of eternity, then you don't get to present God as a scientific idea because you can't study Him. That's the next idea that's presented. And here's the problem with that. We never do science like that. Just because you can't see something, then you can't use that as an explanation. Makes no sense whatsoever. If you have ever watched any CSI or forensic science, you know exactly what I mean by that. Let's say you come to a beach and you look on the beach and there are some footprints, and you look up the beach and you don't see any humans, you don't see any animals. You look down the beach, no humans, no animals. You have footprints on the beach, that's all you have. Can you know anything about the entity that left these footprints without ever seeing them? Yes, it's actually a very well understood branch of science, indirect observation, where you gather information about an entity when the entity is not there. So for instance, let's say we measure these footprints and we see that each footprint, a right and a left, has 5 toe prints. Now we haven't seen the feet. We just see the prints. Can you know how many toes are on each one of those feet that have left the footprint? You haven't seen the feet. You've just seen the print. But you can know exactly how many toes are on those feet. You can know what kind of arch the entity had. Let's say you size it up and it is obviously a human footprint. It's got 5 toes. It has an arch. It has a heel. It has a ball. And then you measure the distance. Well, when you measure the distance, you can get, if you have some availability of information and statistics, and it's a certain number of inches between each footprint, you can know approximately how tall the person is. If you got some real good information and you got some real good equipment, you can measure the density of the sand, and if you knew how long those prints had been there and how dense the sand was when they stepped in it, you could get the approximate weight of the person. So now we've never seen this person, but we know their approximate weight, approximate height, we know how many toes they got on each foot, and we know if they get to be accepted into the military or not. Now that's pretty fascinating. Well, hold on, Kyle. You didn't touch, see, taste, hear, or smell that person. No, I did not. But there's a lot of information I know about them. So what I'd like to suggest is that God is a very scientific idea. Using indirect forensic science, you can come to a very scientific understanding of God. Now, I'm going to interject a Bible verse here, not to prove anything. Because if you don't believe in God at the present, if I were to stand up here and quote Scripture to you, that would not convince you because you don't believe in God. And you certainly wouldn't believe that the Bible's the inspired Word of God. I'm going to interject this particular verse because I want you to see that this is the kind of thinking that has been done for more than 2,000 years. When Paul wrote the book of Romans, in chapter 1, he was talking about humans coming to the idea that there is a creator. And he said in verse 20, "For since the beginning of creation, God's invisible attributes." Now stop right there and just ask the question, what does invisible mean? Well, it obviously means not visible. Okay, the things that you can't see about God. Now, if you've ever read this verse, and I think some of you probably have, there's actually almost a little pun going on in the verse. Because listen to what it says, "For God's invisible attributes are clearly seen." Well, hold on just a second. You can't clearly see something that's invisible. Now, that's the point. Stuff that you can't see about God, you can see. How? Being understood by the things which are made, even His eternal power and Godhead. Okay, so you can look at something God made and know something about God. That's the challenge. That's what the Bible writer is presenting to you. And so our question is, if we were to take this idea of atheistic evolutionary unbelief, and we were to compare it to the idea that there is a supernatural creator, which one of those is the most robust scientific explanation for the universe? And that's what we're going to do this evening. We're going to ask, is God a provable entity using scientific inquiry? Okay, let's start with the scientific laws. Scientific law, something you understand very, very well. It's not something you get to pick whether you like it or not. It's something that is not formulated by humans. It's something that is understood by humans. They view it. Sometimes they uncover a scientific law, but you don't ever change it. You don't adjust it. That's the thing about a scientific law. A scientific law is something that you look at, and it's always that exact same way, and that's why it's called a law. If there were ever a time where you found an experiment or something that happened that went against that scientific law, guess what you would no longer have? A scientific law. A scientific law is something that there's never been a single exception to in the history of the scientific endeavor. In the history of humankind, nobody has ever seen a single exception to a scientific law, and that's why it's called a law. Now, we're going to deal with the most fundamental law that you know and deal with every single day, and it's called the law of cause and effect. And here's what it says simply. In this material universe, every material effect that you see had a cause that came before it and was greater than it. Okay, you deal with that all the time. If we were to take this battery and I were to drop it, this battery falls toward the center of the earth. Now, maybe you remember Isaac Newton wondering why that happened, and the old anecdotal idea that he was sitting under an apple tree and an apple fell on his head, and he wanted to know why that happened, and that jogged his mind into discovering Newtonian physics. That is not actually how that played out, but that's how we're told it did. But, you know, it's a good question. Why doesn't the battery float? It always falls toward the center of the earth at 9.8 meters per second squared, whether you like it or not. You know, what if we said, I don't like it? I'd like to change that. In fact, I'm tired of gravity. I feel like gravity has not done great things for me, and I've got some issues with gravity, and so I'd like to adjust it. Who else would? Who's with me? And everybody here says, well, I'm with you. I'd like to adjust it too. Well, and we get 1 million of the most brilliant scientists in the world, and we get them all to Knoxville, Tennessee, and we say, okay, guys, we're voting on gravity. Who wants that to change? Who wants, when they get up in the morning, to be able to float off of their bed over to their dresser without ever touching the ground? Wouldn't that be cool? Just kind of push yourself? Me, I do. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Everybody says aye. All right, great. We have just changed the law of gravity. All we need is a volunteer to step off a 20-story building, and we will show that we've done it. What, you're not volunteering? I mean, because it doesn't matter how many. Oh, we just don't have enough people. Let's go 2 million. 7.82 billion people? Let's get everybody in the world to vote to change gravity. It doesn't matter. It's not changing. So we've got this law of cause and effect that says for every material effect you see in the universe, there's a cause that came before it and was greater than it. Okay, according to that idea of the Big Bang, that atheistic idea, 13.82 billion years ago, there was a singularity. That's what they refer to it as, a singularity that exploded and brought this universe into existence. So here's the question. If the material universe is all that there is, all that there was, and all that there ever would be, and that singularity is a material effect, what caused that? You know, if I were to stand up here this evening and ask you this simple question, work with me, this is hypothetical, but suppose that you're listening to everything that I say. You're on the edge of your seat. You're not thinking about the ball game tomorrow and how you're going to make sure you get there and cheer when Georgia beats Tennessee by 3. No, that's not going to happen. When Tennessee beats Georgia, I don't know. Okay, now you are thinking about the Tennessee-Georgia game. I'm sorry, I hijacked the whole thing. Now, we're kind of Alabama fans at my house. My son is a real Alabama fan. I'm a bandwagon Alabama fan. It just seemed like a good time to get on board when Saban came. And so we're hoping Tennessee wins so that we get to see a rematch in the SEC championship. But, I mean, just, whatever. Here's what I have learned about people that are Alabama, Tennessee. I mean, they feel like if you put a Tennessee shirt on, it's automatically Sunday clothes. And, I mean, you can walk in, you got the orange. I mean, you're dressed up. My son feels the same way. Get an Alabama pullover, and, I mean, he feels like he could walk into a suit and tie deal and be just fine. Now, that's a digression, but here we are. Suppose, there again, hypothetically, you are listening to everything that I say, and all of a sudden, this little plastic container shoots across the room going 100 miles an hour, slams into the exit sign back there, smashes it into 120 pieces. And you turn and look at me and you say, Kyle, what caused that? And I said, nothing. Sometimes plastic containers shoot themselves across rooms at 100 miles an hour and slam into exit sign. They do. Okay, now every time I have ever used this, and it's been copiously used, I get a chuckle. What if I then said, no, guys, but I'm serious. Sometimes plastic containers really do shoot themselves across rooms at 100 miles an hour and slam. Well, then I get another almost little chuckle, but then a real confused look. And then when I say it the third time, no, what I'm trying to tell you is what you don't understand is that sometimes plastic containers actually do shoot across rooms by themselves. It's at that third time, number one, you start thinking the elders have made a mistake. They should not have invited this individual here because he doesn't know what he's talking about. Or number two, I know this has got to go somewhere, Kyle, but I'm not seeing where it's going. Well, here's the challenge to anybody who doesn't believe in a supernatural creator. You've got that original thing that you call a singularity, but if it's material, it has to have a cause. It has to have something that got it there. Now, I don't know if you know this particular individual. He's probably the only theoretical physicist that any of you know the name of. I know one or two others that I have read some of their books, but Stephen Hawking was the most famous theoretical physicist that basically anybody knows. He had Lou Gehrig's disease. He is deceased now. And he had that chair that was specially designed for him to be able to move it with just a corner of his cheek. He was on the Curiosity television program, the History Channel. And he wrote a couple books trying to explain this idea of unbelief and how this huge explosion supposedly brought the world into existence. And in his first book, he left open the idea that there could be a supernatural creator. And several of his atheistic colleagues basically hounded him and said, you've got to close that door. You need to look at the math or adjust something because you just can't leave it open that there might be a supernatural creator. And so he writes a next book titled The Grand Design. And in that book, he proceeds to give his scientific explanation as to how the universe arose purely naturalistically, without a creator. And here's what he said. Now, this man is the most educated, brilliant mind in the world of theoretical physics. Probably the smartest man on the planet. At least one that is recognized IQ-wise and learning-wise. Here's his explanation. He said, stars don't spontaneously pop into existence. They don't shoot themselves across rooms. He said, black holes don't spontaneously pop into existence. But entire universes do. His explanation for the origin of the universe is that it violates the law of cause and effect. Now here's the problem with that. That is unscientific. When you take the combined cumulative knowledge of the human scientific endeavor from the very beginning of time and you arrive at the law of cause and effect, and this law applies in every situation that everybody's ever studied ever, and then you say, yeah, but if we're going to say that there's no God, you either have to get rid of God or you got to get rid of the law of cause and effect. You either have to get rid of God or you have to say that plastic containers shoot themselves spontaneously across rooms without a cause. Now, what I'd like to suggest to you is that's not scientific. That's not being honest. Now, you can say, okay, that thing at the beginning was matter, but it didn't act like matter. But you then can't say, and that's a scientific explanation. You see, what you've got to have at the beginning of it all is something that doesn't act like matter, because we know how matter acts. We know if you got a material effect, there has to be a cause. So you have to have an entity at the beginning that is not matter, that is more than matter, that is super matter. You got to have an entity at the beginning that's not natural, it's more than nature, it's supernature. That's the best explanation. The best scientific explanation is that there's something that doesn't need a cause. Now, at that point, the person who adheres to this atheistic idea will say, well, okay, well, God doesn't have a cause, you're saying. So what caused God if the law of cause and effect applies to everything? It's a good question. But you didn't listen to the formulation of the law of cause and effect. For every material effect that we see, there has to be a cause that came before it that was greater than it. At some point, there has to be something that would start the universe that has to be not material. Do you know that from the Christian biblical perspective, God has never been presented as material? Always as God is a spirit. Okay, so we know how matter acts. All matter has to have a cause. We need something at the beginning that didn't act like matter. It had to be supermatter. The idea that we're going to take the law of cause and effect and throw it out the door so we can say nothing caused the universe, unscientific. Well, what would correspond logically and evidentiary with the scientific fact of the law of cause and effect, and yet we still have a universe? An entity that is not matter that brought the universe into existence. Makes perfect scientific sense. Now, let's unpack the rest of the law of cause and effect. And the rest of the law of cause and effect says that you have to have a cause that was bigger, greater than the effect. Okay, now, let's go back to our illustration here. You're listening intently. The plastic container shoots across the room at 100 miles an hour, smashes into the exit sign. You turn and look at me and you say, Kyle, what caused that? And this time, I don't give you the crazy idea that nothing caused it. I say, oh, yes, well, great. I'm glad that you're applying your scientific mind, looking for a cause to the materialistic effect. I'll tell you what caused that. A tiny speck of dust landed on the corner of this plastic container and catapulted it across the room at 100 miles an hour. Okay, now, I just presented you with a cause. But what's the problem with that? You still don't believe that. And the problem with that is, I now have given you a cause per se, but it's not big enough. You know, it's kind of like the guy who's driving the UPS truck down Interstate 40. All of a sudden, his truck does 3 flips. He lands in a ditch. You're behind him. You see this happen. You go over to the side of the ditch. Thankfully, he's all right. He's not injured. Work with me. It's hypothetical. And you go to him and you say, hey, are you all right, buddy? He says, yeah, but you got to get everybody off the road. You say, why? He said, they're all over. I couldn't get out of the way. I ran right into one. You say, you ran into what? He said, it hit me square right in the grill and caused me to do 3 flips. That's why I'm in the ditch. You say, what hit you? He said, it was the biggest mosquito I've ever seen. I bet it was the size of a quarter. Hit me right in the grill. You call 911 back and say, you know, we got more head trauma than I thought because this guy's not thinking straight. I mean, if somebody presents to you the idea that a mosquito planting in a grill of a UPS truck causes it to do 3 flips and land in a ditch, that's not an adequate cause. Now then, let's look at how that applies to the universe. I don't know if you know how big the universe is. I actually can go for about an hour and a half on how big the universe is. It's very, very fascinating. I'm only going to go for about 50 minutes on it right now tonight. But it's neat stuff. You know how they measure distance in the universe? They measure distance in the universe in a light year. Now, a light year is not a measurement of time. It's actually a measurement of distance. And a light year is the amount of miles that light travels in a single year. Now, here's how many miles light travels in a second. 186,302 miles per second. Okay, now let that sink in. Light travels 186,000 miles a second. That means if you were to count to 1 Mississippi, it would go around, a piece of a photon of light could go around the equator of the earth 7 times in the time it took you to count to 1. That's how fast light moves. Now, it moves 186,000 miles per second, and a light year is how many miles it goes in a year. So you multiply 186,000 times 60 to give you 1 minute. Then you multiply 186,000 times, well, then you take that number and you multiply whatever 186,000 times 60, you multiply that then by 60, which gives you an hour, And then you multiply that number by 24, which gives you how many hours are in a day. And then you multiply that number by 365.24. Your eyes rolling back in your head? Yeah? Thinking, I did not sign up for math class tonight. I thought this was going to be something different. You know how many miles that is? It's about 586 quadrillion miles. I mean, we're talking about the price of a used car these days. I mean, this is expensive, 586 quadrillion. That's 1 light year. We live in the Milky Way galaxy. If you had a machine that could travel the speed of light, and that were the end of the Milky Way galaxy, and this were the other end of the Milky Way galaxy, and you wanted to get across our one galaxy, and you started going the speed of light, it would take you going the speed of light, not 10 years, not 100 years, not 10,000 years, not 50,000 years. It takes you 100,000 years at 186,000 miles a second to go across the Milky Way galaxy. Okay, that's one galaxy out of an estimated 100 billion. Now, let's broaden that a tad and say this is one edge of our universe, and that's the other edge of the universe. Do you know how long it takes you to be in your machine and fly from one edge to the other edge of the universe? 96 billion years at 186,000 miles a second. That's the size. I say that's the size. They came out probably 4 years ago. I was writing about this, and they said, we've changed it. It used to be we thought it was 46 billion light years across. Now we think it's about 96 or so, but it could be 250 times that. I mean, what even is 250 times 96 billion? Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure we got something to do with it. Next year's used car price. Okay, that's how big you're dealing with. I mean, you got some stars out there. The sun is a middle-sized star. You can put 1,000,000 Earths inside the sun. There are some stars out there that are 2,100 times bigger than the sun. You can put 2,000 suns in some stars. That means you can put 2.1 billion Earths in some stars out there. And in our Milky Way galaxy, until about 5 years ago, they said we've got about 100 billion stars. They said, we didn't calculate for space dust. We actually have about 300 to 400 billion stars in our galaxy, some of which are 2.1 billion times bigger than the Earth. Okay, so then you ask the simple question, according to the law of cause and effect, you have to have a cause that's greater than the effect. We've got a universe that we still can't even wrap our minds around how big it is. And what are we told is the cause? A tiny singularity that popped into existence from nothing. Is there any scientific information that would ever suggest something that small could explode into something as big as our universe? The answer to that is no. But if you say we're answering all these questions just from a materialistic standpoint, we're not looking at the best explanation, only the most materialistic explanation, there's a very clear answer to that. But if you define it out before the discussion starts, then you start getting unscientific. Now, let's go back to the verse in Romans chapter 1. There again, this is not for proof, but it's for insight. For since the beginning of creation, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made, even His eternal, something had to always be there that wasn't matter, power. Something's bigger than anything we've ever seen, and it's not material. Even His eternal power and Godhead. Now that final word, Godhead there's a lot wrapped up in it, but here's one aspect of that I think you well understand. Explosions don't cause order. You know how this works. I hope this didn't happen to you like it did to my mother years ago, but I asked my mom, I said, Mom, can I go to the movies? She said, well, what's the movie? I told her it was a good, clean movie, no problem with it. She said, yeah, you can go as long as you clean your room. I said, oh, no problem. Now, I didn't keep that neat of a room. And so she asked me what time the movie was. I told her we were going to leave about 6:30. So 5:30 rolls around, and I hadn't touched my room. My mom says, Kyle, I guess you're not planning on going to the movie. You haven't touched your room. I know how dirty it is. It's going to take you a while. I said, Mom, I got plenty of time. 6 o'clock rolls around. Got 30 minutes before we leave. She says, Kyle, you're obviously not going. You haven't touched your room. I know it's going to take more than 30 minutes. I said, Mom, I got this. Got it covered. No problem. 6:25 rolls around. She says, you are absolutely not going. No, you're not going. I said, Mom, don't worry about it. In fact, I'll go do it right now. Walk back to my room. I take everything in my room, pile it up in the middle, pull a stick of dynamite out of my back pocket, shove it under there, light it, and walk out. My mom comes frantically running to the back of the house, like any good mother would. And what does she see? She opens the door, and that huge explosion in the middle of my room has completely ordered all the clothes that needed hanging up. It blew the hangers out of the closet. They captured the clothes perfectly on their way back in, and they're hung up in color-coordinated order. My shoes are all matched underneath those. All the electronics are put on the... It was fascinating. I went to the movie, and it was... Of course that didn't happen. No, because it takes 2 sticks of dynamite. Okay, no, but I mean, because we need to blow it up 3 times. No, because explosions never cause order. They cause disorder. They always do. Now, the problem with rejecting the supernatural explanation is that you've got one universe to look at. When you look at it, you know it had to have a cause that wasn't material, and you know it had to have a cause that's bigger than anything we've ever seen. And the next problem is, you're looking at this singular universe, and as one atheistic physicist said, it looks like some super intellect has monkeyed with the physics to make everything look like it was perfectly designed for humans to live on planet Earth. We live on the Goldilocks planet in the Goldilocks zone. You know what Goldilocks means? Well, the theoretical physicists have adopted the term from the story of Goldilocks. 3 bears eating their porridge. That's what always lost me in the story, really, the porridge. But they're eating porridge, and it's too hot. And so they leave. Goldilocks comes in. She tries Daddy Bear's porridge, too hot. Mom Bear's porridge, too cold. Baby Bear's, just right. She gets full, and she goes into the living room, and there's 3 chairs. And she tries Daddy Bear's chair too hard. Mama Bear's chair too soft. Baby Bear's chair, just right. Goes upstairs. She decides she's going to take a nap. Daddy Bear's bed way too hard. Mama Bear's bed way too soft. Baby Bear's bed, just right. The physicists say, we don't know how this happened, but everything looks just right. Now, let me tell you what I mean when I say just right. Imagine you had if you're looking like at an airplane cockpit, and you had 40 knobs up here, and every single one of those knobs had to be turned to the exact perfect place all at once, and no margin of error whatsoever. Let me give you an example of what I mean, no margin of error whatsoever. There are 4 forces basically in the universe that anybody has ever seen. That's the strong atomic force, the weak atomic force, the electromagnetic force, and the force of gravity. Those are the 4 that there are. Now, the force of gravity and the electromagnetic force are so closely coordinated that if you adjusted one of them by a tiny fraction, the other one would collapse, and we would not have a universe. Okay? Now, when I say tiny fraction, I want us to try to get our minds around this. 0.1 is 1/10. That means you take your knob and make 10 little areas on it, and so all you got to do is be in that 1/10 of the area. 0.01 is 100. Okay, so now take your knob and divide it into 100 little areas, and you got to be right there at the right. Now 0.001, 1,000. So now take that knob, and you've got 1,000 clicks on it. I mean, if you're looking at something like a safe, I mean, you only have probably 50 at the most. Now we're taking that knob and we've got 1,000 clicks on it. On these two, electromagnetic force and the force of gravity. You got 1,000 on both of them. Okay, 0.0001, 10,000. All right, so now this and this have to be perfectly clicked at 1/10,000th of a place. Oh, but now here's the real fraction. I don't even know how to tell you this one. The real fraction of adjustment is 0.000 out to the 40th decimal place. And if either one of those knobs is off, either one, dividing it by however many that is out to the 40th decimal place, the universe doesn't exist. Now that's one example of 40 that the atheistic physicists admit. It looks like there was a super-powered intellect that walked into a room and adjusted every knob to the 40th decimal place. And we don't get that from an explosion, but we got to say we did this time. Because if we don't, then we'd have to say that there's a supernatural, intelligent being behind the creation of the universe. 1976, year I was born, 46 years ago. I didn't know this was happening the year that I was born, but it was very fascinating for those who did. A man by the name of Anthony Flew wrote a book in 2006, on the cover of which was this statement as the title, "There is no God." Anthony Flew, in the 60s, wrote a paper called Theology and Falsification that he presented to the Socratic Society that C.S. Lewis chaired. That still today, as I understand it, is the most widely written about, published, reprinted, philosophical atheistic paper ever put out. He would tell you that in his 2006 book. He was recognized in the world as the leading atheist in the world. He was from England. He had his PhD from the University of Reading. And this is not local. This is not localized. It's not like he is recognized as the leading atheist in a certain area. And you're talking about in the world, basically. He's debating a man by the name of Thomas B. Warren in 1976 in Denton, Texas. Thomas B. Warren has a PhD in philosophy from Vanderbilt University. Member of the Lord's Church. Some of you may have even had the privilege of sitting and listening to Thomas B. Warren. In Flew's book in 2006, he says that this is the most people he's ever spoken to live in his life. Leading atheist in the world. He's speaking to 5,000 people every night live in Denton, Texas. It's a 4-night debate, 2 hours every single night. In one of those sessions, Thomas B. Warren uses this simple argument as he proceeds to refute the idea of atheism. He puts up a picture of a prosthetic hand, an artificial limb. Now, back in 1976, the way that you did that was you had an overhead projector. It was on a clear piece of plastic. You put it here, a light shone under it, and it projected it to the screen. And in 1976, prostheses were light years, little pun, behind what we got going on now. It's just a simple prosthetic limb. And he said, Dr. Flew did this prosthetic limb, did this prosthetic hand and arm segment have a designer? You know, we've come a pretty good ways since then. I've got an article on our website titled "A $4 Million Piece of Evidence for God's Existence." And it talks about a 10-pound metal alloy arm that a man by the name of Dr. Kukin, who was the research and implementer director of this particular project, put on a 26-year-old Marine's shoulder. Fascinating. This young lady lost her arm in a vehicle accident. They have this 10-pound metal alloy arm, cost $4 million. That's not talking about the research and development of it. You're talking about just the construction of it. It's got motors that attach to the fingers. They literally take wires and hook them up to the nerves in her shoulder so that when she thinks about moving her pinky, Well, they originally don't wire it correctly, as I understand it, and so she would think about moving her pinky and the thumb would move. But what was fascinating is the electrical impulses from her brain going from the nerve to the wire to the motor would literally, accurately, once they got it figured out, move a digit of the hand. Dr. Kukin said, this is amazing. He said, we've never seen anything like it. Said she can take a jar of spaghetti and hold it with one hand and a spoon with the other, and she can scrape out the spaghetti jar sauce with no help. He said in prosthesis, this has never been done before. He said she can fold a pair of pants without a hard surface. Nobody's ever seen it. Dr. Flew, did this prosthetic limb have a designer? Yes. I mean, you got to say yes. If you're going to stay the world's leading atheist, you can't say, nope, just popped into existence from nowhere. Don't know how prosthetic limbs come up. You can't say that. You have to say yes. Okay. Take the overhead slide off. Put the next overhead slide of a pencil drawing of a human hand. Just a regular old human hand. Thomas Warren said, did this one have a designer? Take a hammer and smash the metal alloy finger of a $4 million prosthesis, and what happens? Somebody immediately comes to you and asks you for your insurance number. Other than that, though, work with me. In 6 weeks, you come back and it's still smashed. Take a hammer and accidentally smash your forefinger while you're working on a shed out back. Your body immediately starts a process where it sends information down to your finger to trigger an enzyme that knows how to dissolve bone, and your body decides what bone needs to be dissolved and what bone can still be used to repair your finger. Now, get a hold of that just a minute. Your body has an enzyme in it that dissolves bone. Let's say that goes haywire one night, and you wake up the next day. Oh, I wonder which bone has been eaten overnight. I don't know, but you don't want that to happen. And guess what? Your body is so well designed that doesn't happen. And not only that, your body then begins to move the pieces of bone back into place that need to be repaired, immediately begins to start repairing those with properties and chemicals and elements in your body that are there. And within 6 weeks, although your thumb might be crooked when it gets done because you thought you could climb a tree without a limb and it didn't work for you in 6th grade, it might come back crooked, but it still works. And many times, depending on where the break is, it's stronger where you broke your bone than it was before you broke it. And what did you have to do? Well, just stay off of it and wait 6 weeks. Now come back to that metal alloy finger and wait 6 weeks, and what happens? It stays broken until or unless what? An intelligent man like Dr. Kukin says, oh, bring it back into the lab and we'll fix it. So Thomas Warren asked Anthony Flew, with a human hand, did this have a designer? Dr. Flew says, nope. Thomas Warren said, how did it get there? Flew said it just grew. Just grew. You mean to tell me the prosthetic limb that even in 2008 or 12, when Dr. Kukin made the most advanced one that had ever been made, he said, but it's still clumsy. Clumsy compared to what? The clumsiest left hand in this room, which is probably mine. I can't do a thing with my left hand. When I try to throw left-handed, my kids say, Dad, please never do that in public. Any hand we've got in here is more advanced technologically than every prosthesis that anybody's ever seen, regardless of how many millions of dollars have been dumped into it. That was in 1976. Here's what I like to think. I like to think that when Anthony Flew got up in the morning, he grabbed his toothbrush and put a little toothpaste on it and saw how his hands worked so perfectly that one would just squeeze the toothpaste just enough to put just the right amount and not too much, and his other one would brush his teeth just hard enough to take care of that little morning fuzz on them, but not too hard to do any gum damage. I like to think that the statement from Thomas B. Warren, how'd it get there? How'd it get there? How'd it get there? How'd it get there? I mean, that's nerve working 5 times, isn't it? You think about, for 30 years, every time you look at your hand thinking, how did that get there? How did that get there? Let me go back to his book and conclude this lesson. His book in 2006, There Is No God. The no is marked out. And there's a big red A above it, and the actual title is There Is a God. How the world's most notorious atheist became a believer. And here's what he said. He said, I have always, in all of my scientific and philosophic endeavors, have tried to follow this piece of advice, to follow the evidence or the argument where it leads me. He said, years ago, I thought it led to atheism. He said, I now know it does not. The evidence overwhelmingly, scientifically, philosophically proves that there is an eternal, supernatural, all-powerful, intelligent being behind the origin of our universe. There is a scientific explanation for why you're here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is the most robust scientific explanation for the origin of our universe that has ever been uttered. Sure appreciate you being here this evening. I'm looking forward to the weekend. We've got a lot of great things planned. Tomorrow we're going to be dealing with dinosaurs, which is one of the most common, I guess I'm going to say the most often asked question that we have at Apologetics Press. And as you came in, you noticed that we've got some books and things back there. Let me explain just a little bit about those to you. We are a nonprofit organization, and that means that we could not function without charitable donations from people, and that our sales would never do it. We don't really like to sell stuff. We'd rather give it to you. There are price tags on those books and things that are back there. Everything you see back there is on our website absolutely free. You can download it in article form or book form. You can get any digital copy of it that you want. Along with that, we've got hundreds of videos that deal with stuff like I did, and they're any number of length. We've got some videos that are 2 minutes and 3 minutes and some that are 45 minutes, etc. All of that is absolutely free on our website. Now, if we print something, it costs money. We put prices on there, but if you, let's say you do not believe in what we're doing here at all, and you think I don't like this, I don't want to support what they're doing, but I'd like to read that book. Okay, take it. For absolutely free. Don't worry about it. Don't feel any prick of conscience whatsoever. You take it. Let's say you see a book that's on that table and it's for $20 and you've got 3. Okay, put 3 in that thing and take it. Let's say you don't have any. Okay, take it. That book is going to accomplish exactly nothing on a table. Now, we sell them because it costs something to print them, but we don't want any type of financial idea at all to get in the way of you getting something that you need. And that's what I want you to know about the materials we've got. There are a couple books that go with kind of the lesson that we did tonight. This Truth Be Told book is a book that deals with the information and evidence that we dealt with tonight on about a 6th through 8th, 9th grade level. This book is one that we have successfully gotten in the hands of all kinds of middle schoolers and lower high school, 9th, 10th grade, 8th grade, across the country. Sometimes they'll have me as a author come in for Author Week. And there are ways that you can pass out these books in school. One of those ways is, hey, I come speak as an author. I put the book on a table. There's something about handing one out. What was that? I don't know. But there's something about handing it to the kid that you can't do, but you can put it on the table and say, if you want it, go get it. I was speaking at an elementary, well, it was a middle school, I think, that had 330 5th through 8th graders. Put them on the table, said, if you want it, go get it. They were gone in about 3 minutes. And little kids were coming up saying, can I take one to my cousin? Yes, take one to your cousin. You absolutely can. Had one mother that called us and said, hey, I want every kid in my son's first grade class to have that book. And we said, well, it's written on a 6th or 8th grade level. It's kind of high level. She said, I know, but it's got everything that they're going to need in their school with evolution and atheism being taught and stuff. I want them to have it. And I've gone to the principal, and he said, give it to my son's fellow students as Christmas presents. And so that's what she did. I think we gave them to her for $5 a piece, and she bought 30 of them, gave them to every one of her first grade son's kids' class for Christmas presents. That's an idea. Well, here's what happened the next year. In 2nd grade, she wrote us an email, said, we had a very pro-evolutionary teacher, and she was teaching this 2nd grade class, and one of the kids that just got the book the year before said to the teacher, that's not right. What you're telling us about how animals and things got here is not right. God actually created them. And she said, well, our book says different. And he said, well, I've got a book at home that says God did, and it shows the evidence for that. And she said, well, that book's wrong. The 2nd grade. And he said, well, what that book teaches makes more sense than what you're telling us. Now, it does. It does. Now, I think he said it in a very respectful way, but it does make better sense. Now, here's the thing, though. Here's the thing. We're going to have a great weekend, and we're going to have 25 kids come to this, if we're lucky, 30. And there's going to be 30,000 that are still in your area that are never going to get to hear that God made them. And here's what the proverb writer says. The first person who pleads his case seems right until his neighbor comes and answers him. But if you are sitting in that 2nd grade class and you got a pro-evolutionary teacher and your mom or dad has never taken you to anything like this and they're not religious in any way, then what do you walk out of there thinking? I am a product of random chance processes over millions of years, and I'm no better than a bacteria from which I evolved. But if somehow that kid is taught, that's not true. You're here for a purpose. There's a God who fine-tuned this universe perfectly, and he designed you to be on this planet, and you're valuable not because of how fast you can run, not because of how smart you are, because you're made in his image, and it doesn't matter what else happens to you, you'll always have value. Well, you've got a culture, a society of kids right now that they hear that from nobody. So what are we going to do about it? We've got to do something about it. Is there one kid in your life that you could say, hey, I want you to know you're real special. God created and designed you, and he put you here for a purpose, and here, take this, read about it. If you got any questions, let me know. Is there somebody in your life you could do that for? Because I'm convinced that if we as the Lord's church don't do it, it's not going to get done. This book deals with what we did on a upper college, almost type graduate level. We got another book out there titled Science versus Evolution that is really thick, that if you are not interested in this, it will be a great book for you to take and use to put yourself to sleep at night. Just the first 3 pages will be about all you'll need. Now, if you are very interested in this, and you have somebody that says, okay, well, hold on just a second. What about the first and second laws of thermodynamics? And what about the equations that answer all? Okay, if you want to do some real heavy reading and at the end of that come away with, okay, I mean, I knew it was true, but now I know it's true. That's the book you need. I've been doing this for 23 years, and after I got done with that, I took my shirt off that was so sweaty because I had waded through it and thought, if you read that and you stay with it, that does it. That answers just about any question you've got. And all that's on our website, free. If you're like me, you like a book. I like a book because, what I want to do is take a pen to it. When I read something, I think, oh, that's good. And so I just go back. Some of us like books. Some of us don't. You can get that online. One more I'm going to tell you about, and then we'll take some question and answers for a few minutes here. This is the Apologetics Press Defending the Faith Study Bible. For years, people said, do you have a study Bible that you would recommend that's out there? And we did not, because every study Bible that we had seen had some material in it we just did not feel corresponded with either accurate science or accurate understanding of the Bible. And so about 10 years ago, we decided we're going to put one together. This is a 2,500-page full-color. New King James is the biblical text, and it has about 1,000 pages of material like the stuff we did tonight. All the scientific evidence that points to a creator, along with all of the evidence that points to the inspiration of the Bible, the deity of Christ, along with a proper teaching and understanding of the organization of the church, of the plan of salvation, you name it. It is in here. Now, in the course of our work at Apologetics Press, our most popular book is Dinosaurs Unleashed, has been historically. We send out about 1,000 of those a year. This has been out about 3 years. We've got 32,000 of them in print now. About 28,000 of them already out. Here's why I think that is. I've got one for my wife, one for all my kids. Last year when young people started sending us graduation cards, I thought, okay, we're going to get everybody a study Bible, because if you are serious about spiritual things, this answers just about every question you would run into if someone were to be trying to push something on you that's not accurate. Evolutionary teaching, atheistic teaching, teaching that's not theologically accurate. If you're a kid and you're sitting in Comparative Religions 101 in Bart Ehrman's class in the Chapel Hill, the University of North Carolina there in Chapel Hill, and he says, you know that the Bible is not really inspired because there's all kinds of contradictions. Just look at Mark chapter 3 and Matthew chapter 4. You go to Mark chapter 3 in this, every single alleged contradiction you've ever heard, probably 600 of them in here. You go to Mark chapter 3, there's the passage that explains how Mark chapter 3 and Matthew chapter 2 are not contradictory. You don't have that on hand? Well, you might be challenged with, oh, God, I didn't know the Bible contradicts itself. You flip over there and you read a good, logical, often very simple explanation that professor just didn't want you to hear, and you walk away thinking, hold on just a second. Number one, this guy's not as smart as I thought, and number two, he's not being honest with the text right there. And you start having a young person that's critically analyzing this teaching, and instead of swallowing it thinking, wow, I didn't know these guys are so smart. And so you can really make a difference. So this has been a fascinating product that I absolutely love. Wish I had it when I was growing up, and feel like every single person in the world that is serious about spirituality at all needs one. And have tried to get them for as many people as I can. And I think if you did that, they would thank you, and you could make a big impact on people. Now, we've also gotten to send, I think we've sent 2,000 of them to different places overseas and things, to preaching schools and people that are in positions where they would need that kind of study if they're teaching at a preaching school or if they're students, etc. So we've got some of those things. If you have any more questions about those, they're on the table, and I'll be glad to answer any questions about those. Let me tell you that I'm very passionate about what we do at AP. I've been there 23 years. Plan to stay there as long as I have breath in my lungs to stand up and talk about stuff. And just really feel like in our culture right now, this information has to be disseminated. And if it's not us, it's not going to be anyone. And we've got to do it. What questions do you have about the material that we discussed on the scientific nature of creation, or anything involved in anything we're going to do this weekend? It might be that I'll say, hey, we'll get to that tomorrow or Sunday. But it might be, hey, that's not on our list, and we need an answer to that tonight. And so be glad to field any questions. Now, just lay down the groundwork before we do. I always say this, but it's always the rule. One rule about questions and question and answers. You can only ask questions I know the answer to. You stick with that? I mean, we're good. So just make sure we pre-approve those. Yeah, what you got? Okay, here's his question. Can you explain very briefly how the size of the universe is calculated, and do you agree with that? Here's what you find out about science and the information you actually have. Many times it's not the facts that are under dispute, it's the interpretation of the facts. And so you dig up a dinosaur fossil, and we are told it's 65 million years old. Here's what you've got. You've got a fossil. Now, the interpretation of the 65 million years is based on some assumptions and things that we'll get into tomorrow. But you have the fossil, and there's no arguing with the fossil. Everybody admits there's a fossil there of a dinosaur. So the question is not, hey, is this a real fossil? Yeah, of course this is a real fossil. It's everybody who's thinking correctly recognizes what's going on with the fossil. But the next question is, okay, where are you getting the age for that? So the way that the estimated, now, and just let me put estimated in, because at the end of the article, remember they say, oh, and it could be 250 million times that. Okay, so if you're measuring the circumference of a ball and you say, I've got a good way to measure it, but it might be 250 times bigger than that. Well, I'm not sure your way to measure it is all that accurate. But basically what you're dealing with is the distance of a light projecting heavenly body and seeing how big that is and how long the light would take from that thing to this thing, to planet Earth. Now, here's what you do then with that. You make an analogy. And so our sun is 93 million miles on average distant from planet Earth. And it takes 8 minutes for light to get from the sun to planet Earth. Okay, so you take all the stuff you use to calculate that and then say, okay, here's a star behind the sun, and that takes this many minutes. Well, how do you know it takes this many minutes? Okay, stuff like this. Number one, maybe you see a flare on that star that you did not see 12 minutes ago. Okay, so that star, like a sun flare, you were looking at it, there was no flare, boom, now there is a flare, and it took 12 minutes because you took a picture of that exactly 12 minutes ago. Okay, so now you know the distance of that one, in theory. Okay, so then as you look out into space, you use those same types of calculations, and then there's something called redshift, that if something is moving away from you, the waves get a different length in between the troughs and the peaks, etc. So that's how they do it. And it's very complicated and potentially very inaccurate, but if there are certain assumptions at play, then okay, yeah, that's probably right. That is probably 96 billion light years. Although we can't see to the end of it. Here's basically what we're saying. Okay, we can see this far, and if we can see this far, we figure it's that far. And so, okay. Now, the problem with the whole discussion is if you've got a star light traveling from that star would take, say, 1 million years to get to Earth, or let's say 65 million years, or let's say 1 billion years. In theory, if that star was born and light started moving away from that star when it came into existence, and it's 1 billion light years away, then how old would the universe have to be? 1 billion years. And so lots of times that idea of starlight and how far something away is used to say, well, this obviously proves that there are billions of years. Now, here I think is the simple answer that is very intuitive and makes perfect sense. When Adam and Eve were created, how old did they look? I mean, they certainly didn't look one day old. Now, we know the natural process of a child being born and then growing up into a human, but when Adam and Eve were created, they were fully human the first 1 second after they were created and were told to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. You've got a tree in the Garden of Eden that is maybe potentially 8 feet in diameter. How many rings does it have? I mean, you've got to have tree rings for the tree to stand up. You got a 150-foot tall tree in the Garden of Eden. It's got to have the rings for it, and you chop it down and you start counting the rings. Well, there are 582 rings. What does that mean? It's 582 years old. No, it's 1 day old. So I say all that to say, if the universe was created by God and stars were made on day 4, then when God created the stars, it very, very much makes sense that He created them fully mature along with probably every stage of light paths to those stars. Let me tell you what I mean by that. You put a tree in the Garden of Eden. Some of them have fruit immediately. Some of them have blooms. Some of them have fruit that's not ripe yet. Some of them might have even had, well, there probably wasn't any rotten fruit in the Garden of Eden. So you probably had blooms, leaves, fruit that was ripe. All the stages of the fruit immediately when it's created. And so what I would suggest is a very easy answer to that idea of starlight and time is that when God created the stars, He created them with light paths in any number of stages, and the assumption that the star was created, was born from naturalistic processes, and it took 1 billion years for the light to get there, well, that's based on the idea that there's no God that created that. And if there's a God that creates it, and He creates things with apparent age, what we would look at like age, okay, Adam looks 30, but he's not, then it makes sense that those light paths would have been created along with the stars. Really good question. Next question. You got one to top that? I mean, that's a good one. And we weren't getting to that in the rest of the weekend, so, I mean, that's a home run from the get-go. Yes, sir. Okay, he says, how accurate are the tree rings? Here's the problem with tree ring dating and ice core dating and things of that nature. You have to go off of the assumption of uniformitarianism, which means if you see it happening now like this, then it always happened like that. And there are a couple things that the Bible writer wanted you to understand could not be that way. Let me tell you what I mean. 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter says, now scoffers are going to come in the last days, right there in verse 3. He said, and they are going to say, where is the promise of His coming? For all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. He said the scoffers are going to say, this isn't happening because the sun rises every day and it sets every day. And if there's a tree ring that grows this year, a tree ring grows next year. And it always happens the same way. But here's what he says. But this they willfully forget. That number one, the earth and heavens were created by God. Okay, guess what? That's never happened again. Something was going on, that first event, that doesn't happen now. He said, and number two, the global flood happened. And so that idea of, okay, annually this happens. Well, if there's a global flood, is that going to mess up what annually happens on the planet? Absolutely, positively. He said the two big things that people who buy into uniformitarianism neglect to reconcile is the creation and the flood. Now, I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. We know for a fact that lots of those ice cores and tree rings can be sub-annual or more, meaning you could grow 2 rings in a year, or 3 rings in a year, or 5 rings in a year, and it would depend on the atmospheric and weather conditions. Same with a ice core. I don't know if you watched the Ken Ham Bill Nye debate, but in that debate, Bill Nye really focused on those ice cores, and he said you can basically drill down, get you a big cylinder of ice, and you know how much ice is laid down per year, and this thing is 650,000 of those, so the earth has to be at least 650,000 years old. Bill, hold on just a second. You know for a fact that some of those are sub-annual, that you can get more than one a year, but you didn't tell anybody that when you said that. Why not? Well, because most of us don't know that. And so we're going to have thought, okay, well, I mean, I saw one of these last year, and one of those last year, so the last 40 years we've looked at it, last 100 years we've looked at it, look like the same. Okay, let's say there's a global flood, and you have a water on the whole planet, and then an ice age that comes in right after the flood, and some of that water comes up and then goes back, and it freezes and comes up and goes back and freezes. Could you have multiple layers in those ice cores in a year? Absolutely, positively. And we know for a fact that happens. And so it's not accurate stuff because you have to assume that it's always done like that. And here's the other thing about that tree ring dating. You don't have any tree rings that give you over 10,000 years. It's not like there's a tree that's 10,000 years old and you can chop it and you got 10,000 of them. The oldest ones we've got are bristlecone pines that are approximately 5,000 years old that would date really right back to the end of the flood. What they are saying they do is take the rings from this tree and match it to a younger one because it's the same stuff it looked like was in the atmosphere, and then and so they match them up. Well, lots of times that matching up process is not accurate because they say, okay, the 112th ring of this tree matches the third ring of this tree. So we got 112 years, and now from the third year of this tree, it goes, you see where that's going? And so they try to match them, but lots of times that matching is not accurate. So the problem with that is the uniformitarianism idea that it's always been the same. And all of these things we've got articles on our website about. You type in tree ring dating, we've got technical explanations for every bit of that. Very good question. Yes, ma'am. Okay, what about carbon dating? Very good question. C14 dating. What you're often told, and what I think most people think, is that carbon dating gives you the millions of years. And lots of times people associate carbon dating with dinosaurs and things of that nature. Carbon dating, even the inventor, W.F. Libby of carbon dating, said you can't use carbon dating for anything over a few thousand years. And then even after that, it gets real fuzzy. Carbon dating only works for organic substances that were once alive, that take in carbon. So, okay, let's say your body right now is taking in C14. When you die, it will start releasing it. Well, what they basically do is calculate the rate of the releasing of C14 and say, okay, now if this particular organic body died, it's got this much carbon left in it. If we use the present rate of release of carbon, then that means this is 3,500 years old. Okay, that's true. Here's the problem. In the past, could it have been different? Could the atmosphere have been different? If the flood world was different, would you have had a very different C14 transfer rate, etc.? And what you're often not told is that, okay, we've actually registered rate variations, but for our discussions of dating, we throw them out because that would change the way that the dating would work, and so we're going to say this is an anomaly and not really how things actually go. I'll give you an example. They have found in scores of dinosaurs soft tissue, red blood cells, and collagen. Eric Lyons, my coworker, called the lady who was first on the ground floor of finding this in a T-Rex bone. She explained it to him, and he asked her, well, was there anything else odd there? And she said, yeah, it was covered in black stuff that looked like carbon. But it couldn't have been because it's a 65 million year old bone. He said, did you test it? She said, no, it wouldn't do any good to test. I mean, it looked just like carbon in another place, but it wouldn't do any good to test it because we know it's not carbon because the bone's 65 million years old. Well, there are traces of carbon in stuff that would be 65 million years old that don't even get tested because they throw that out to begin with. Because they say, well, at this rate, there's no possible way that could be that. Well, hold on just a second. There's no possible way that collagen could last 65 million years either. But you've got hemoglobin parts and collagen in a bone that you said was 65 million years old that we'll get to tomorrow that's not. And so, same problem with your tree ring dating. And then there's a group of dating methods called radiometric dating methods. And those are the ones they use to get you the billions of years, where something like uranium breaks down into lead over 4.5 billion years, the half-life of it. And that is where they try to pull the billions of years, but they're, again, based on the same assumptions. The three main assumptions. Number one, the rate's always been the same. Number two, there was no stuff in it to start with. And number three, nothing has touched it for 4.5 billion years. And those three assumptions you just cannot grant. And here's the funny thing about that. I say it's funny. Anytime you know the age of a rock for sure, let's say a volcanic island is created from a volcanic eruption in Hawaii, you know for a fact it's 200 years old. You know it for a fact. You date it with radiometric dating, it gives you dates anywhere from 4 million to 93 million years old. You know it's 200. I was talking to a guy about this from, the evolutionary perspective. He said, well, it doesn't work real well on young rocks. Okay, so every time you know the age, the dating methods are wrong. Literally. But then you say, okay, well, we know that's 200. We know these dating methods don't work. But over here, we don't know the age, so they work over here. Okay, no. All you have to do to disprove the radiometric billions of years dating methods is go find rocks that we know the age to, take them to a place that dates them and say, okay, date these. Now, here's what you find out. And this is really underhanded. But they won't. They don't date them unless you tell them where you found them and how old you think they are. Because if you took 200-year-old rocks to the dating laboratories and said, date this, and they came back and gave you the dating methods that it registered as, and you got to publish that data, that'd be the end of it. Now, we do have some of that data published, but it's few and far between, and you got to pick it out, and we've got it on our website. But it's interesting to me that when you know the age of the rock, it doesn't work. But then they assume it works great when you don't. And that doesn't make any sense to me. Okay, we'll take one more question. And then, you guys have been so patient. I mean, you've been sitting there for at least 35 minutes. One more question. You got one? Oh, that wasn't a hand raise. It was just like a, okay. Anyone else?
Okay, thank you, Kyle, so much for coming. Did I tell you the truth that you'd be glad that you came tonight to hear Kyle Butt? So you need to come back tomorrow. He's got a lot more information to share with us. We'll have another Q&A tomorrow. So if you had that question that just now popped in your head when I stood up, you can come back tomorrow and bring it with you. 8 o'clock in the morning, we'll have some breakfast, and then we'll start at 8:30 with Kyle again. And if you would, bow with me as we dismiss in prayer. Our most gracious and loving Heavenly Father, we're in awe of your power and your glory. And Father, just being here tonight and hearing about the awesome size of the universe that you created, and Father, the details with which you created us. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. And Father, we thank you for the reminders we've gotten tonight, the new information, the bolstering to our faith. And Father, we pray that you would be with us as we travel home tonight, as we get rest, and that we would come back tomorrow refreshed to learn more about your greatness and to strengthen our faith even more. We're thankful for Kyle and his study and the fact that he chooses to travel and share with others the information he has to bolster their faith as well as his. And we're thankful for him, and we pray that you would be with him. Be with us all and bring us back tomorrow. In Jesus' name we pray this prayer. Amen. You are dismissed.